Imaginary friends, a staple of childhood. But in Dover, Indiana, those friends may turn out to be more than a figment conjured by a child's mind. The big bad wolf was my imaginary friend, for better or worse, and he forever changed my life. It's funny how long-lost memories creep back from the past. I never forgot the dream nor wolf, but for a long time they were filled away in the dark corner of my mind. Now, the hidden beasts crawl their way out of the dark and into the light. He's rocking my chair, Mommy. I stared into the living room from the safety of my parents' bed. My tiny rocking chair lurched forward and back beyond the doorway to the living room. Who is? My mother looked to the chair, but he stopped as soon as she turned her gaze. My friend, the big bad wolf, I answered. He stooped behind the chair and peeked at me around the backrest. Mischievous glint shone in his eyes, and he teetered the chair forward again as my mother looked away. He's doing it again. She looked. He stopped. He's doing it again. She looked. He stopped. This game went on a few more times before my mother had enough. She got up and moved the chair out of sight. The wolf disappeared. Tell me about your friend. She returned to the bed and turned down the volume of the TV. Well, he's a big green wolf. He lives in the furnace room, and he likes to play with me. I squawked. Why do you call him the big bad wolf? She cast a superstitious stare into the living room. My mother held a firm belief in the supernatural and imaginary friend, screams haunting. It's the big bad wolf, Mommy. I corrected her with a stern tone, at least as stern as a child could be. You can't forget the, because he isn't just any old wolf. Well, what makes him the big bad wolf then? Her gaze softened, and she looked down at me. Perhaps she was satisfied that this was a game of a child and nothing else. He likes to play tricks. And Wolf stood behind her now. He blew on the back of her neck. Her face drained white, and she turned around. Wolf was gone again. She turned back to me. Her eyes grew wide and her face hardened like stone. Don't worry, Mommy. He won't hurt you if you play nice. The chair sat in the doorway. It lurched forward and back. Moving furniture, items vanishing and reappearing only after the search was forgotten. Phantom steps in the night and voices from inside the walls. I lived through it all with my mother and father, but I wasn't scared like them. I knew that it was only my friend playing around. My father and I sat on the living room floor. I played with my race cars and tried not to look him in the eye. I could feel his stare on the crown of my head. My father rolled the black Mustang back and forth. Why did you throw a rock at the garage window, son? His voice was expectant and firm. The devil made me do it. I crashed a tie-dye flower van into an empty beer bottle. A screech squealed from the brakes before the dreaded clink and explosion. Look at me. My father's tone turned cold and absolute. The Mustang came to a sudden halt as he tapped my shoulder. Look me in the eye, like a man. I raised my head to meet my father's gaze. His brown glare bore holes in my eyes. His frown was framed by his bushy black goatee. His nose, blood red, well on its way to purple. Tell me why you did it. His words were long and drawn out. The devil made me do it. He slammed his hand against the floor. That's bullshit, he yelled. The devil can't make you do anything. You did it because you wanted to, and you're gonna tell me what the hell you were thinking. My dad was quick to anger, but he only struck me once in my whole life. When I was a teenager, I told my mom I hated her, and even then, he cried harder than I did. My eyes welled, I felt the streams. Tears streaked my cheeks, but I wasn't crying because of my father's outburst. He couldn't see him. He couldn't see that the big bad wolf was sitting between us. But he didn't look right. His fur was patchy and matted. Drool pooled on the ground. His crooked yellow fangs were bared, and his eyes were milky white. This was the devil. This was who told me to throw the rock through the garage window, or he'd never bring my friend back. The devil leaned in and whispered in my ear. And that was my life. I loved the big bad wolf, but I hated the devil. I always thought of them as different people when I was younger. I suppose anyone calling themselves the big bad wolf probably isn't that good to begin with. But I didn't know any better. Things got bad when I turned 6 years old. I spent a lot of time in the woods behind my grandmother's house with Wolf. I wanted to be just like him. I even tried being naked all the time, but that was quickly quashed when my grandmother dragged me inside by the ear and swatted me with a fresh switch. I settled for only wearing shorts. We ran through the woods and chased squirrels and rabbits. I wasn't very good, but Wolf never let anything get away. He was fast and strong. He'd snatch something up and give it to me to finish off, but I couldn't do it. I always felt bad for the animals. And Wolf told me it was the way of nature, and that I needed to get used to it. One day when we left the woods, something was off. Wolf didn't run down the hill and scare my dog, Sparky, like he usually did. The breeze fell flat, and the birds silent. The air felt stagnant and cold. Goosebumps prickled my body, and I heard the distinct sound of water dripping against dried leaves. I knew he stood behind me. I turned around, making sure not to make eye contact. I faced the devil and stared at his knotted, crooked feet. He leaned in. "Hello, Brian." His breath was sickly sweet, and rot trailed each mouthful. "What do you want?" I wasn't afraid. I just hated him so much. I couldn't bear to look him in the eye. I hated the feeling it gave me, a feeling far beyond hatred. "Look down the hill." He pointed his arm over my shoulder. His fur was musty and soaking wet. It was hard not to gag. I faced back downhill and looked up. His wretched, bony finger hung loose in the air. I followed the general direction and saw our neighbor's big, mean black cat. I looked down at my right forearm and inspected the scar it gave me after I tried to pet it once. A raised streak that stretched from my inner elbow to right under the knob of my wrist. It curved like a C and formed a thin smile. "Kill it." His voice was raspy and quick. The phrase sent a shock rolling down my body. My heart raced. A knot twisted in my gut. "I can't. Please don't make me do that. Just bring the big bad wolf back." "I'll give you a little more incentive. Not only will you never see your friend again, I'll kill your dog instead." His arm retracted like a wilted flower. I spun around to face him, my face flushed with rage and my eyes spitting hate. But he was gone. I heard Sparky yelp down the hill. I spun again and froze. The devil held Sparky up by his leash. His legs kicked in the air, desperately trying to find support. There was no thought. "Okay, you win, I'll do it." I choked back my sobs. I blinked and Sparky was on the ground and the devil was behind me again. His muggy breath gripped my neck like a firm hand. My vision blurred and everything slowed down. When I came back to my senses, I stood over a freshly dug grave. I was alone. I felt lost, not myself. The sun was long and gone, and a crescent moon shone dim light into the bleak night. I knelt and sobbed until my grandmother called me home. I didn't see Wolf for 3 days. I still remember when the neighbor girl came to our house later that week and asked my grandmother if we'd seen her cat. I looked in her swollen, tear-filled eyes and lied. I don't remember what happened, but I knew exactly where her cat was, buried in the woods behind my grandmother's house. I regret many things I did in my youth, but by far this was my greatest. I sat in class and stared at the board. My teacher, Mrs. Stanton, drilled us on our multiplication tables from 1 to 10. I fiddled with the earpieces on my glasses. I didn't need a prescription. They were fake lenses that my mother gave me, so I'd stop bugging her about needing glasses. I found out by wearing my grandmother's glasses that I couldn't see Wolf with them on. My glasses worked just the same. He always made it hard to concentrate, and his tricks usually got me in trouble anyhow. I lifted my glasses by pushing down on the back of the earpieces, and every time my eyes were bared, Wolf stood in a different pose behind the teacher. I lifted them faster and faster to see how quickly he could shift between poses. The Thinker, a soldier's salute, Uncle Sam's I need you, and even Luke Skywalker holding his lightsaber in the air. I couldn't help but laugh. Mrs. Stanton never looked too kind to interruptions. She pointed her ruler at me with such force, I thought the old stick would snap. Freeze! Her voice bounced off the windows behind me, and everyone sat up straight on the edge of their seats. Unfortunately, I froze with my glasses up. Wolf towered behind her. He was frozen mid-swing with an imaginary bat, like he was about to hit a home run off of Mrs. Stanton's head. After a moment, he crumbled to the floor, starting at his knees. I followed suit and collapsed to the floor in an imaginary puddle. "What are you doing, Brian?" Her words spat quick and thin through gritted teeth. I smiled. "You can't freeze at room temperature." How lucky I was to be born in a time when the paddle had long been retired. That didn't stop the principal from waving it in my face and telling me about the good old days. She even went on as far as to call my mother and ask if she could use it, but there was no need. I went home that day and took my whipping all the same. I wasn't allowed to wear my glasses to school again, as they were too much of a distraction on top of being unnecessary in the first place. School became harder for me from then on out. I was labeled the class clown and assumed the role of victim to my first bully, Jack Jefferson. But like the few that would come after, he wasn't my bully for long. He stood taller than the rest of us. He had at least 6 inches in height on me. He was gaunt in face and frame. His teeth were as crooked as his sense of humor, and his hair as dirty and unkempt as his baggy clothes. He employed the tactics of a boy in grade school, name-calling, spitwads, tripping, and throwing pebbles at me on the playground. Each time he challenged me, Wolf was there begging me to lash out, telling me I needed to show him who's stronger, who's really at the bottom of the pecking order. I ignored them both the best I could. One day, during lunch period, I went to the restroom. I stood in front of the urinal and relieved myself. Jack stepped behind me and shoved me into the wall. My chest smashed into the urinal, and the wind was knocked out of me. I fell to the floor in a pool of my own urine. "Look at that," Jack sneered as he poked at me with a sneaker. "You pissed all over yourself." I'll go get your mommy, little baby," he snorted and turned to leave. I caught my breath again and pulled my pants up. A rage like nothing I'd felt before filled to the brim. "Shut the fuck up, you white trash cousin fucker." It was the first time I'd ever cussed. I just said the first thing that came to mind. Funny enough, I heard my dad say that one to one of his friends, but he was joking at the time. I was pissed. Jack's neck and ears burned bright red. He spun around and grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and lifted me up to his nose. "I dare you to say that again." I felt a weight in my chest and the world slowed. A strange kind of mist clouded my mind. Water spilled out from under the stall behind Jack and pooled on the floor. And I heard him in there. The devil. He whistled, the wheels on the bus, slow and off tune. His hand clawed and gnarled, reached around the doorframe. He peeked out and our eyes met. And I'd never seen him look so angry, so hungry, so decayed, so eager. His milky orbs peered into mine and my anger exploded. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Jack yelled. I snapped my gaze back to his, and I'm not sure to this day what he saw when he looked into my eyes, but his face twisted as our eyes met. His mouth hung loose and his eyes widened. He tried to pull back, but he didn't let go of my collar in time. I swung my fist as hard as I could and crashed my knuckles into the side of his jaw. His head whipped to the right and he collapsed to the floor. My knuckles burned, but it felt good. I lifted my fist again, but before I could hit him again, he scrambled out of the bathroom, crying the whole way. I didn't get into trouble. No one believed that Jack was savagely attacked by me, at least not without cause. The principal called my mother and explained what happened. Jack was suspended for a week. I was taken home. Hell, my mom even told me I did a good job for standing up for myself. Of course, I didn't tell her about the cousin fucker part. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it felt good hurting him. It felt good letting all my anger out like that. I didn't see Wolf for a long time after that, but I felt him. I knew he was there. I was sad at first, but as time went on, my sadness faded. It became natural to always feel like I was being watched. 5th grade, 2 years after the last day I saw Wolf. In that time, I grew fast and strong. I didn't take shit from anyone, and I transformed from class clown to troublemaker. I honestly wasn't in any better of a situation. I didn't get picked on at all that much anymore, but I still didn't have any friends all the same. I felt alone and angry. I tried to make friends with 2 boys that I walked home with from school. I suppose walked in the same direction is a better way to describe it. Zachary Dearson and Michael Smith walked together. I just lived on the same side of town. For a month, I tried to make friends with them. I tried to join conversations. I showed them cool rocks I found. I shared snacks with them. But in the end, they just didn't want me around. The final day I ever walked home was also the last day I ever saw Wolf. The 3 of us walked home. They trailed behind me, which was usual because I was the one that tried to keep up with them. They walked over the hill next to the old shoe factory, and that's when it started. Zachary and Michael chucked rocks at me. At first, light tosses bounced against my book bag, but it soon escalated into full-force throws at my legs. "Why don't you just go away, you freak?" Zachary said. "Yeah, we don't like you. Don't you get it?" Michael joined. By the time we reached the bottom of the hill, my legs were sore, and they called me every name under the sun. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry at that point. I just accepted the situation as it was. There weren't people I wanted to be friends with after all. I was just determined to change course and take the long way home until I felt a rock beam me in the back of my head. I fell to my knees and the boys chuckled and snorted like pigs that they were. I felt it. I felt that feeling that haunted me ever since that day with Jack. Rage overflowing. I wanted to kill them. Something in my head screamed it repeatedly. Kill, kill, kill. I felt the command surge through my body. A cold fire burned away at every thought, every inhibition. I seized the thick branch next to me. It was heavy and solid. The end of it was knotted and formed a fine club. "What's he doing with that stick?" Zachary sneered. He lobbed another rock at me. "I think he's going to hit us with it." Michael mocked the very thought in his tone. I turned and faced them. The color drained from their faces, and they dropped the rocks. They stared into my eyes, and I theirs. With all my willpower, I tried to scream through my eyes my intention, and everything in my body told me to pounce. I'd club Zachary first since he was bigger, and then finish Michael. But I didn't. Even with the voice screaming at me inside my head, drowning out my own thoughts, I could just barely hear my conscience. I didn't want to hurt anyone. They slowly turned away from me without uttering a single word, and took the long way home. They never spoke to me again after that day. That night I slept with a troubled mind. I floated near the ceiling and stared down at myself sleeping on the couch. It had been years since I dreamt like that, but now I was lucid, aware of the familiarity. I felt a tug, an urgency to soar into the air, but I remained. I didn't want to leave. I hovered around the room. I saw my parents asleep in the next room. I looked at my father's model ship collection. I took stock of every bottle on the table. I was bored. Outside, I heard a raspy scream. I popped my head through the window. Under the streetlight on the road stood a man. He was cloaked in the shadow of his own hanging head. He wheezed and sniffed. He lifted his head and looked at my house. His head tilted like a curious dog, and he shuffled through my neighbor's yard into mine. His skin was boiled and slick with pus. His eyes were darkness and his mouth a bottomless void. He passed my window, but didn't acknowledge my head jutting out the side of the house. His wailing was sharp and filled with agony. His scalp was peeled back, revealing cracked skull. He walked up the steps and stopped at the door. He traced the door frame with the caution of something testing if something is too hot to touch. He placed his hand firm on the door and wheezed out a laugh. The man stepped through the closed door and walked next to my sleeping body. I rushed over and tried to fall back into my body, but I couldn't descend. I was stuck in the air. I watched as the man lowered his hand to touch my face. A panic swelled in my gut as his rotting finger drew ever closer to my skin. Before he touched my face, the man stopped. A green mist poured from my open mouth and Wolf appeared. He perched in the air above my body, and the man took a step back. He quaked and his wheezing intensified. Wolf growled and his form shifted. His hair molted into matted patches. His eyes filmed over milky white. His fangs became crooked and yellow, and his fingers twisted and gnarled. The devil died in my mind. For the first time, I saw them as one and the same. Wolf reared back and unleashed a horrific howl. "He's mine." He lunged at the man and bit into his neck. The man dissolved into black mist as he screeched in terror. Wolf walked over to my body and tried to place his hand on my cheek. "No!" I yelled with all my might. The wolf stood rigid. His hand hovered just above my cheek, unable to make contact. He looked up at me after a moment of searching. It was a realization and an acknowledgement of my presence. Our eyes locked, and there was fear in him. A fear I'd never seen in him before that moment. My feet touched the floor and I stood in front of Wolf, staring up at his great height. No utterance, not a single word. There was an understanding. It all came back to me. I remembered more than just the floating dreams. I remembered the woods and the beasts within. Hoping, waiting. I reached my hand out to touch his chest and Wolf tried to step back, but he was locked in place. It was too late. When my hand contacted his cold, damp fur, a light pierced his body and he howled in pain. Wolf split into two forms. My hand rested on the head of the wolf with fur pure as snow and eyes that shone blue as clear sky. There was sorrow in his eyes. Behind the wolf stood a creature much like the rotting man that wolf attacked. Its skin was green and cracked. Its face was stuck between a scowl and a weeping frown. Water surged from its milky white eyes and poured in streams from its mouth as it gagged and choked. It was a wretched creature, and it looked at me with such longing, a deep want, avarice. It looked back to the wolf under my hand. "I'm sorry. I can't help you. I don't know how." The wolf stared at me for a moment. I think it understood, but I can't be sure even to this day. I lifted my hand off the wolf's head, and the creature and it merged once more. A trap door appeared next to us on the floor. "Please don't send me back." His eyes radiated sorrow and defeat. In that moment, I made a choice. For better or worse, I made it. The room around us turned to shifting shadow, like black fire. Every outline squirmed like a million ants. We were pulled between our world and the other, a small crack in the road. There were no people or animals, no demons or angels, just Wolf and me. "Goodbye," I said it as cold and absolute as I could. Wolf only stared as the world melted with him in it. The fires died and I appeared in my home again. It was over. He was gone. A weight lifted from my shoulders that day. I stared down at myself on the couch for a moment. Something felt odd, though. I heard a creak from the furnace door, just beyond the threshold of the room I was in. I looked up. A haggard woman appeared through the crack of the door at me. A sliver of light shone, revealing her yellow eyes and twisted smile. She squealed and slammed the door. I shot up from the couch in a cold sweat. I peered behind me at the furnace door. My heart raced and I stared for a long while waiting for something to jump out. But nothing did. I laid back down and stared at the ceiling. I heard 3 distinctive knocks on the wall next to my head. And that night, a weight greater than Wolf was placed on my shoulders. That night, I met the lady in the walls. But that is a tale for another time.